This is the second lecture on transport planning, and I'm hoping that you're listening to this before the field trip. So again, the learning objectives are around figuring out how integrated the transport is in your region, looking at the various modes and how your local region has planned for those modes or not, looking at what strategic plans exist and perhaps critiquing those plans, using information from the field trip to look at some of the questions about the transport planning in your region, and understanding what institutions, stakeholders exist and how they do or don't work together. So this week is about the middle set of questions around sustainable transport, what you need to do to move to a more sustainable transport model, which requires us to look at land use planning and zoning, the principles underlying sustainable transport planning, what a good strategic transport plan might look like. So we'll look at some examples to give you some ideas so that you can have a more critical lens at which to view the planning for your own region. In terms of the field trip, I'll just say this now as well as repeating it before the end of the second lecture. So this is really looking about how to change the mode share from what is probably a car dominant city, although your region might not be, it might be a bit different, to looking to see how to get more of a balanced design that we looked at earlier with respect to Munich, Zurich and Copenhagen. So what might need to be deliberately planned and what might need to change in terms of infrastructure and incentives to open up options around transport, particularly for people who don't live in the inner city, who don't have access to the resources that mean that they've got options. What needs to change? On-campus students will need to at least flick through the consultation document. That's the City of Hobart Transport Strategy. It's still being developed. It's still in draft mode. It's long, but have a look through and familiarise yourself with that before we go and talk to the author of the strategy as part of our field trip. And distance students, have a look for your regional transport strategy. So this might be looking on your council's website, or you might need to go at a higher level and some sort of council amalgamation, some sort of regional body, or potentially even the state government, but you're probably looking at a lower level than that. And finally, okay, so this section is very much taking the perspective that a greater share of non-car modes of transport is a good thing. You might argue with that, but this is about sustainable transport. And so the texts that I've used in preparing this material have titles like Moving People, Sustainable Transport Development by Peter Cox, Planning Sustainable Transport by Barry Hutton. They're both recent books, as well as the chapter in Regional Planning by the great Paul Mees, who is no longer around, but who had quite an impact in terms of thinking about sustainable transport. So these texts all mention the role of zoning and land use planning, and that this has to be done in concert with transport. And so looking back to the first week, we can see how important land use planning and suburban regional development is, and how integrated it is with transport. So we need to take a look at zoning. Linked with that is the role of development control. So what can you legally build, and what will your council make you do or not allow you to do that might either favour one mode of transport over another? We look at the importance of infrastructure investment, particularly around public transport, and how there's really no getting away from spending quite a lot of money. We look at some examples of good integrated planning and other market tools that might influence whether sustainable transport plans are actually able to be implemented. So again, if you haven't already looked at the City of Hobart document, have a look at perhaps the freight chapter, module 1 that's already been finalised. But also the current chapter on private transport, which is where most people are going to chime in and have their say. So sustainable transport planning, I've drawn on Barry Hutton's work, particularly the final chapter in his Planning Sustainable Transport book called Planning Sustainable Transport, the Agenda. It's a pretty technical chapter. I've annotated it and told you where to skip over. There's a couple of pages at the front about carbon accounting and how you might actually get the data that show, in terms of carbon emissions, the different likely emissions from different plans. Really quite difficult to read, and obviously very difficult to do, often because the data aren't available. But having ploughed through this chapter, here's the 5 things that I think he outlines as being the most important. So in Planning Sustainable Transport, Hutton argues that really the end goal is about low carbon emissions, however you achieve that. So as low as possible, given all of the kind of political imperatives and the structures that you've already got in place that are going to last a long time. That land use planning, it has to be in sync with transport planning, that there has to be major investment in public transport to make it efficient and reliable, and decouple it from any problems with congestion. So if you're going to, for example, in Hobart, rely on buses as public transport, you can't allow those buses to be stranded in car congestion. There has to be some kind of priority system that means that if you go to the extra effort of catching the bus rather than jumping in your own car, that it's going to turn up on time and get you there reliably, and you're not just going to be sitting in the same congestion that you would have been had you taken your car. That Hutton underlines the importance of car parking policies and plans that are consistent with transport goals and consistent with land use planning, and underlines how important car park planning is for sustainable transport planning, and often it kind of slides under the radar, and this might be a little bit the case with City of Hobart because the car parking strategy has already had an overhaul. So this might be something that you need to go to separately to have a really good look at the detail of what's proposed and how that might work for or against the proposed integrated transport planning strategy. Lastly, in this chapter, Hutton argues that clear priority for pedestrians should be one of the main goals that you're trying to achieve. at the end of the day, everybody is a pedestrian, even if it's just walking from your car in a central car park to your destination, until people figure out a way for you to drive to your toilet, which is something that former chief of Metro was fond of saying, that if Tasmanians could drive to the toilet, they would, then everyone is a pedestrian. So this means giving priority for pedestrians and good amenity for walking, making it easy and efficient to walk around, not making pedestrians wait for a long time at intersections, not giving them an incentive to cross the road where they shouldn't be crossing the road, or crossing the road against a red light. And this in itself, while it might not be a particularly expensive overhaul of the way that central urban transport systems operate, it would nevertheless be quite a radical thing for a council to do, to really give clear priority to pedestrians. So yeah, that first bit of the Hutton chapter on carbon accounting is really quite difficult, and he doesn't even go into the kind of nitty-gritty of how to do it. So if you find that all a bit overwhelming, just skip past it. In fact, I've even put at the top of a couple of the pages a note that says maybe this is a bit difficult for this unit. So just skip over it if it gets a bit technical, like page 397 I found pretty hard going. And I've put notes in and tried to translate into kind of lay language where possible later in the chapter. But there is a lot of good material in that chapter, so it is worth having a look. So have a look at to see what you can find for your region. I'm going to let you dig up the Tasmanian stuff, the Hobart stuff for yourselves. So here's the overall look at transport emissions by sector for Australia, and you can see that transport is a really large section of the pie, and also transport emissions by mode of transport. We don't have trains or light rail in Tasmania, but you can see the difference between the different cars in that bottom row there, between very efficient electric vehicles, new cars, and the average car, which is an older, less efficient car. Not included here are any stats around walking and cycling, probably because they wouldn't feature because they're so efficient in terms of carbon. But another point that Hutton makes early on is how most trips are multimodal, and I'll get onto this a bit later on. Discussion of sustainable transport and transport planning wouldn't be complete without mention of rapid bus systems. So the most famous example is Bogota, Colombia, and their rapid bus system really transformed the city in terms of unclogging or giving options, I guess, other than car travel. So as you can see from the picture, there's still a lot of cars in Bogota, but the development of the bus system that runs completely separately to where the cars are really transformed the city. They went in quite hard in terms of building a long section as the first stage to make it as useful as possible to as many people as possible, which was a fairly brave move and took a succession of mayors who were able to make difficult and at the time unpopular decisions and spend a lot of money. So you can see here that both systems are well used, the rapid bus system and also people in cars. And Bogota is interesting from a range of perspectives because they have also really invested in cycling and walking infrastructure and making the city a lot more permeable in terms of getting around safely and in a low stress way, other than having to take a car. So if you are interested in this, it's a good example to start with. And in the reading that we have done last week, there was mention of Bogota, but there's certainly a lot more material if you're interested in either this for your region or just more generally looking to follow up on it? Well, it would be remiss of me not to cover light rail and the controversy in Hobart around whether the tracks that are no longer used for commercial rail and are sitting idle should be converted into passenger rail transport. So this is an idea that was raised by Paul Lennon in 2007, as has been in the media pretty much ever since. So here's a grab from the Mercury showing the current Lord Mayor of the City of Hobart, Sue Hickey, with the rusted rails, and also an artist's impression of Riverline, which was pushed quite heavily when Minister McKim was the Minister for Sustainable Transport in Hobart in the power sharing arrangement between Labor and the Greens before the Hodgman government came in. And they spent quite a lot of time and effort looking at light rail as an option for northern suburbs transport. So it's tricky economically to work out what assumptions, what data you should use. And so there's been a lot of conflict because there's not a lot of agreement over how you should do the accounting and the cost work. The current Infrastructure Tasmania Chief, Alan Garcia, put out a case study, it's probably now a couple of years old, maybe 18 months old, saying that he didn't think the case for light rail was particularly strong yet, and that demand needed to be higher to make it a viable proposition for government to invest in. So this ties back to questions around transit-oriented development and which should come first, whether you wait for demand to build up and then build the service, or whether you build the service and then demand for the service rises as the infill opportunities along the line come up. So either way, the point remains that City of Hobart and City of Glenorchy, who are the two councils along this rail corridor, could implement policies around preferring development along the rail corridor, trying to get development that faces the rail corridor rather than always having the corridor as a fairly ugly back door. So stay tuned for this issue, but if you're not doing Hobart, the trains might be a very important transport mode in your area. And so, I look forward to hearing what you've all got to say about rail transport. Hutton expresses the principles underlying his view of sustainable transport around carbon emissions and says carbon accounting is really what we're all after. Most principles of sustainable transport range across the 5 points I've got here. I guess you could view them through the lens of lowering carbon requirements, but some of it's also very broadly about sustainable places. So it's more than just sustainability in terms of our fuel requirements. So there's usually some kind of statement around the concentration of urban growth, limiting sprawl, those kind of unserviced areas that pop up if you don't plan for a more balanced approach, and providing for more mixed land use. Making sure that there are options for less polluting, lower impact modes of transport than a car-dominated city, which means maintaining an efficient public transport system, an integrated transport system for both passengers and goods, recognising that for most journeys, one transport mode is rare. Even for people using their cars, they're also walking. And more generally about protecting historic sites, archaeological resources, generally considering the noise, aesthetics, cleanliness, ambience of a place, actually thinking about placemaking as part of your transport planning. So what might a good transport strategy look like? There's lots of different examples that I can show you. Melbourne is interesting in that in lots of ways there are two different Melbournes. There's the planning work that's done for inner Melbourne, particularly by the aldermen who are part of City of Melbourne, who are charged with looking after the inner city. They're quite a green council, as are some of the other neighbouring councils, and have really done a lot of good planning work around mixed use, accessible, active neighbourhoods. And this is contrasted in what's happening in outer Melbourne, where development is increasingly turning agricultural land into new, very poorly serviced suburbs. So to look at an example of good planning work, I would go to Plan Melbourne. Canberra also has some really good strategic planning around transport, has a different mode share than lots of parts of Australia. And then there's lots of examples from North America, which has a more kind of car-oriented history than parts of Europe, but also University of Tasmania Vice Chancellor and many senior staff recently went to Europe to look at university cities and how they might model University of Tasmania planning around European university cities. And quite a lot of that trip was about transport and how you might get a more sustainable transport mode share into planning at UTAS. As you already know, Hobart's transport planning is getting an overhaul at the moment, so please do look at the draft document for City of Hobart Transport Plan from 2018 to 2030. Hobart has been one of the more proactive councils and actually has had an engineer in a sustainable transport role, and that person, who is the author of the current draft strategy, was also the person who drove sustainable transport planning in the council over the past kind of decade or so. So have a look around the City of Hobart's webpage for their sustainable transport plan. It should pop up when you Google it. And for some of the complementary documents, so the parking strategy is separate, but it's a really important part of Hobart's planning for good sustainable transport. And there's mention of the car parking strategy in the new document, but you'll need to actually go to that document separately. It's a whole separate planning document. Okay, in 5 years of working in transport planning, I know what a bad plan looks like. A good plan should have the following. As with all planning documents, there needs to be a clear statement of objectives, and the actions need to follow from those objectives. So it's not uncommon to see kind of motherhood statements in the first part of a document, and then actions that don't relate to those stated objectives or goals. A good transport plan mentions all of the critical components that Hutton talks about. There needs to be an explicit plan around how to deal with car parking and how the council, usually council we're talking about, is going to tackle the thorny problem, emotional problem of not necessarily providing a car park for everybody everywhere they need to go. It also needs to deal with freight. This might be in a separate plan, but in terms of sustainable transport, moving stuff is just as important to consider as moving people. There needs to be a process for regularly checking in on how things are going. So it's not enough to write a nice plan and then not action it. So this leads on to objectives or goals. being smart. So they need to basically be measurable, realistic, time-bounded goals. You don't want to be writing objectives that kind of sound like they're heading in the right direction, but there's no accountability around them. So it needs to be a really concrete statement of what needs to be achieved that's in keeping with the overall spirit of the plan and that can be measured. So you can get to time X, whatever's specified in the objective, and say, okay, did we achieve this 2% increase or extra 200 people, whatever it was? So that in a good objective, there's also consideration of what data you're going to collect in order to know whether you're achieving that objective or not. This is where most transport plans fall down and where I'm constantly pulling my hair out, because a lot of active transport planning in particular doesn't marry in with the works plan and the operational budget. And it's not okay to have a strategic plan around active transport and not provide means of getting that into what's called kind of shovel-ready projects, where maybe the council doesn't actually have the budget, but they've got it all planned out. They know exactly what the existing measurements are of the space, the road. They know what needs to be done. They know what costs are involved, and they have a plan for meeting those costs, whether it's from their own operational budget or from some other budget, such as an application to the federal government for Stronger Regions funding. So many transport plans fall down on that last component, where it really is just a document that sits on a web page that kind of complies with council's need to cover off on a range of topics, but it just sits there, which isn't good enough. So in looking at your transport plan, most of these should be obvious just by the material that's publicly available. For the last one, you might need to actually ask a few questions around how the glossy document that sits on the web page does actually articulate in practice to things getting done. And finally, the references. Do get in touch if you're confused about any of this. Email is definitely the best way to catch me.